Hey everyone, Adrian here. Welcome back to the Conversations with Adrian podcast. Today I'm joined by Nathan Apffel. Nathan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It'll be a good conversation. Aussies always make for good conversation.
Is that right? Yeah, well, we're just talking off air how you've come to Australia a few times. And we'll welcome you back soon, all right? I've been watching you for a little ways on the Instagram as I normally do. I find my guests kind of like through podcasts and interviews and things that I listen to and I resonate. And one of the things that really struck a chord with me is this business of religion and something that I find really fascinating. But before we get into that, I wouldn't mind you sharing some of your journey so far to sort of get you to where you are right now, if that's all right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm a filmmaker by trade. I've been doing it since I was 18. I've worked on everything from Temptation Island to feature films to commercials. Um, and I just love cameras and I love telling stories. It's kind of it's what I do. I would say you could say it's serendipitous or, act of God or whatever. But when I was 16, I almost died. I had a traumatic brain injury. And I was really big into action sports, and I was a surfer and BMXer, and I had to pick up a camera and just start filming my friends instead of actually riding and doing the sports. And so that's kind of what got me started. And then in my late teens and early 20s, I started working for Quicksilver and Billabong and Rip Curl, and I was a free agent and I just traveled the world. So I've been to Australia a bunch, and I love the Australian culture and the good surf, good food. And so flash forward to my late 20s, I was raised in a big Christian megachurch in Los Angeles, and it just always, I had more questions than answers growing up. And so in my late 20s, I started talking to some close friends who were pastors. And then my brothers both work in ministry. And I just started kind of poking the bear, so to speak. And so I picked up a camera and do what I do. And I traveled around the US for about 6 months filming at different mega churches. We got arrested at some. Uh, and I was kind of just a kid screaming at a wall, so to speak. Nothing, I didn't really have any direction with the story. I was more just frustrated and trying to figure out the problem, which is religion has become a business. And we were cutting the show, and I just didn't like the way it was going. And so we just shelved it. And I had a daughter and kind of grew up a little bit. And 12 years later, I didn't stop researching, but I realized, okay, now's the time to go back at it, not from a youthful kind of, I wouldn't say arrogant approach, but just from like I was in my late 20s, I was more angry. Whereas
Mm.
now I'm coming at it from more of a loving, almost fatherly approach, where there's great things that come out of religion and great things that come out of church experience, if you want to call it that. But then there's this dark side that is so dark, especially here in America, and so corrupt that
Mhm.
I can't not expose it. And so that's what's led me to this moment is through the last 12 years of research. What I thought was like would be a pretty simple rabbit hole to go down has become super complex, and it's almost $1 trillion a year. It's $1 trillion a year rabbit hole, and that's just Christianity. That's not
Wow.
Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism. That's just Christianity. So when you look at it from a global perspective, it becomes this never-ending rabbit hole, so to speak. So that's been the hardest thing, is figuring out what angles we're taking with the show, just because
Mm.
there's so.
So when you were in your 20s and you started going down this rabbit hole, then was it kind of like a, what the fuck sort of moment with when you started to discover the business side of it, the monetary side? Did you feel kind of like betrayed in a sense that, why would this happen in your faith or your religion? Like, am I on the right track? Was that kind of where the anger was coming from? Did
No,
you
the
did you
anger
ever?
the anger
Sorry, go
came
on.
from more personal experiences.
Yes.
So I'm the type of kid that, well, I'm not a kid, I'm almost 40, but I'm the type of guy that, like, I see the best in everybody. So I see the best in pastors, I see the best in siblings, I see the best in
Mhm.
friends. I see, like, we've interviewed death row inmates in America, and we've interviewed MS-13 gang members that have raped people on the trains up from Honduras. And I see humanity in everybody. No matter how horrible you are, I can kind of find a human element in people. And so I put a lot of trust in religious leadership over the years. And then one of my mentors throughout my junior high pastor and high school pastor, he was being kind of raised up to take over this really large church in San Diego. And then all of a sudden come to find out that he and his perfect family with a bunch of adopted kids, he was raping them the whole time. And I had three different experiences like that where it just made me really question the integrity of the whole system. So it wasn't even the monetary issue that rubbed me wrong in the beginning. It was more a character issue.
Yeah.
You know, like how are there so many wolves and so many greedy, selfish, money grabbing individuals in this industry? And then the thing that my anger came from, they cloaked themselves in this holier than thou. I
Mm.
am the authority in the church. I've been put here through God has placed me in this position and you can't question that.
Yeah.
And so that was more the approach at that point. It was in my late 20s, it was geared towards leadership and failed leadership. And then it turned into the money side of it, where I was like, whoa, there are hundreds of billions of dollars flushing through the system, almost a quarter of the United States tax revenue, and
Yeah.
no one knows where it goes. And
Fuck.
so that was the eye-opening moment for me. And that's when I realized it was way bigger than leadership.
Yeah. Just to circle back to like the events that were happening with, some of the pastors and things like that with children and bits and pieces. Like, I think that's the most disheartening part. I mean, it's not that it doesn't happen outside of religion, but it's the most disheartening part of particularly a lot of religions, because it just seems to be synonymous with that sort of area, if you know what I mean. I've got experience in high school where it's the same. I went to a Christian college, and the teacher, the principal at the time, it was around about 1993, maybe 92, 93. I'm not quite sure. It's around that early 90s. So the principal was discovered that he had been molesting children, and
Mm,
he escaped the state, so to speak, flew or drove whatever up to Queensland, and eventually killed himself.
mm,
And so I just remember that day that we were kind of brought into the classrooms, and school was kind of like off for the day, and they're like, just stay here for the moment, and they're kind of sort of mitigating any kind of outburst of what would happen in the community. But where I'm from, like, it's sort of, you can trace back over the years, there's people in authority like that have abused their authority, and but more so in religion. For me personally, it definitely leaves a bad taste in your mouth, because you're like, there is so much good that can come out of religion and the messages and things like that. But then when you have this happen, it almost
mm.
like clouds any kind of messaging, and makes you sort of detract. And it did for me. But what was that experience for you? Because I mean, are you still religious? Do you still believe in God? Is that something that you still practice, your faith and things like that?
Yeah, with the show, we're trying not to talk about our personal, faiths and our personal theologies and all that, strictly because the show looks at the legal structures. We're looking at the nonprofit sector here in the U.S. as a whole. So we're not taking the theological or faith-based, arguments by any means. And so we really don't want people to be interested in our personal journeys.
Hmm.
You hit a very interesting note where you said it seems like it happens more in religion. It does. And what we're realizing here in the States, and it trickles over into Australia and really globally, but people, when they've misidentified the word church. So church, they see it as the building they go to, where they go and worship, where they go and commune together, which is great, but that's not church in its purest sense. Church is just the people. And so what's happened is we've lumped kind of what, like, let's call it the layers man has built on top of church over the centuries, and we call that church now. And so what happens is, since we call everything church, there's no accountability for anything that we've created on top of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And so
sure.
what the show tries to do is we're trying to separate the two. We're trying to say, okay, if you're religious and you believe in Christ, Christ said his church is the people coming together. okay, so what's the building? What's the music? What's the coffee shops? What's all that? That's all institution that we've built on top of that. And so if we can separate those two for religious individuals, then the religious individuals can start saying, hey, this stuff needs to start being held to account and be transparent, because what happens when we're not transparent or institutions aren't transparent? Humans are going to human. We're selfish. We're greedy. We have we're strong sexual desires. It's like baked into us as humans. And so religious institutions, and Christianity in particular, have dug themselves into a horrific hole, because there's no accountability for leadership. There's no accountability for use of funds. And so what we're seeing right now, from that guy molesting kids, to my youth pastor raping his adopted kids, to people stealing billions from churches, that's just a byproduct of what Christianity's built on itself. And
Mm.
so that's kind of what the show is unpacking, is, okay, we've built a very complex, shady system. So how do we bring accountability and transparency back into that system, to where leaders are actually held to account? And
Yeah.
because it's proven that when people have to be accountable and transparent, they're more honorable. And
Yeah,
so, and why
for sure.
shouldn't, and you'd think that religion or religious institutions would be the beacon of that,
Mm.
but instead they're the dirtiest of all players, dirtier
Yeah.
than governments, in my opinion.
Oh, wow. That's a statement.
Yeah.
Okay, what discovery did you make that led from that era of well, that area, I should say, of that kind of sinister behind the scenes activity, and then drove you towards the money side of things, like to realize that um there is a business side of it that is quite rife, and it seems like, yeah, like there's a lot to be said about that, but I'll let you do the talking. How did that sort of, how that pendulum swing into from one thing to another?
Yeah, so I'm gonna say one thing real quick. You said the word sinister. I think, or a lot of these things that we're seeing aren't necessarily sinister. Now, granted, molesting children, that is extremely sinister. Stealing as much as you can, that's extremely sinister. A lot of the stuff that we're finding is just these pastors are byproducts of the current system, just like you and I. You were byproducts of your college, career. I was byproducts of my youth in a church. And pastors or clergy go in understanding the system, and so they just get spit out at the end of their career, kind of burned out, and they're like, hey, I wasn't paid that much, or maybe I was, but I took a little bit off the top. And if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily,
Wow.
I don't want to paint everybody as sinister. There are some very sinister players, but I think it's more just we're byproducts of the system, the religious system we play in. I sat down with the former chief counsel to the IRS in Washington, D.C. on the nonprofit sector here in the U.S. and religious tax codes, and he blew it wide open for me,
Hmm.
from a financial perspective. And he just, in the U.S. in particular, the nonprofit sector was defined in 1913, and Congress enacted the income tax. And so they kind of carved out this sector for 12,000 nonprofits. And these 12,000 nonprofits included religious churches at the time. So there's 12,000 of them in 1913. And they said, hey, this is kind of where civil society is coming together to better the US. It's these small nonprofits in these small communities, and they're doing great work. So we're not going to tax them. We're going to kind of let them do their thing. And flash forward 111 years, and those same regulations, those same archaic old school regulations, this is before computers, people were in buggies and getting pulled by horses at this time. Those same regulations, a lot of them are regulating this techno driven nonprofit sector in the US that now has 1.8 million nonprofits. So it
Wow.
went from 12,000 to 1.8 million. And now 5.6% of the entire US GDP floods through that sector, and there's no accountability and no oversight. And so the former chief counsel says, Nathan, the system's so pressurized and there's so much capital moving into it with so little oversight that it's going to buckle on itself. You're talking about $1.42 trillion a year that floods through that in individual donors, like donor giving. And there's almost no accountability to that. So It's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. Yeah. So in terms of when you say it's going to collapse on itself, what do you mean by that?
So what I assume what he means by that is there's so much fraud and inurement and embezzlement going on and so much
Mhm.
self-dealing in a space that is supposed to be for the community good that people are going to just eventually there's going to be so much fraud that the whole system's just going to collapse because
Mm,
people are just going to stop giving to it. And then what happens when all these quote unquote causes that are out there doing good in the world, their funds dry up. So that's what he means is it's just going to
yeah,
buckle. Like
sure.
people are going to, there's going to be so much fraud and it like the stories we're exposing. We personally believe the show is going to shift giving in the US based off of our investigations that we're going to be presenting.
Mm. But it wouldn't be, would it be fair to say that there's a good portion of that money that goes towards, like, that's a lot of money, right? So there's a good portion that would go towards good things like helping the youth, homeless, all that sort of stuff. Is that where you found as well? Is there kind of like this the skim off the top happens, or does the pendulum swing really rapidly in terms of how much, I don't know, like the priests and the pastors and the people that are running the show are kind of like taking their cut as well? Like, how does that work?
We got to separate the nonprofit sector in the US into two different arenas. You have the nonprofit sector, the secular nonprofits, and these are the nonprofits that are, you know, hospitals, colleges, homeless outreach programs. And then you have the religious nonprofits, and the religious nonprofits have different exemptions. They have more exemptions than a standard nonprofit, right?
Hmm.
And so the standard nonprofit has some oversight. They have to file what's called a 990 with the IRS every year. And this is a legal document that they can be legally tied to. So if Adrian donates to my nonprofit and you look at my 990 and you're like, Nathan, only 5 cents of every dollar I've given you actually goes to help, those the youth in need or whatever, I'm not going to give to you anymore.
Mm.
So the secular nonprofit sector has some oversight and some accountability. The religious nonprofit sector does not have to file a 990. So there's no legal document. In Australia, it's different. But in the US, a church does not, or a religious organization does not have to file a 990 or any legal document. So what that means is there's no way to actually put a pin on a board about, okay, this is what this church actually raises, or this is what they actually spend their money on. So it's all hearsay. Everything's set at the feet of the morality of those church leaders, if that makes sense. So
Yeah,
100
sure.
years ago, churches were local. If I like here in Utah, if there was a church 3 miles away, I'd go to that church because I either had to walk or take a horse or something.
Mhm.
And so that pastor could only, or that clergy member could only take so much. But now you have pastors, like Hillsong out of Australia and C3 out of Australia and Bethel on the East Coast. You have these huge, almost conglomerates that are raising tens, if not hundreds of millions a year, and no one
Mhm.
knows where that money goes. So what do they
Wow.
do? Sure, what we're seeing is, yeah, they do great work. Hey, we spent $2 million on homeless outreach last year, and they market it and say they've done all these things. And it's like, yeah, but you raised 400 million. You know what I mean? It's like that's like where does that other 398 million go? Where it goes to is, these pastors, some of them are worth the most wealthy pastor here in the US is worth 750 million now. Like a
Wow.
semi-successful pastor will probably be worth 15 million, 20 million at scale. And so it's like that's a very lucrative business to go into.
Yeah,
It's all the linchpin is the moral compass of that leader, which is wild. And so that's where
sure.
you got to separate the people from the institution, and then we can drive some regulation or some oversight into it, hopefully.
Got it. So with the show, the aim is obviously to expose that this money is not accounted for and it's not going to the good things that the general public feels like when the trade comes around and they're giving in their tithing, so to speak, or they're donating to their local church. It's not going where it's supposed to go. So are you kind of following the money to see like where it is? Like what's the purpose of the
Yeah, so we
show
follow
other
the
than to
money.
expose that?
Yeah, we follow the money from like let's call it a national and then global snapshot, because we get a lot of pushback from people who are like, "Oh yeah, my church does great things." Sure, there's great churches out there. We're not denying that.
Hmm.
But when you look at the system as a whole, less than 6 cents of every dollar leaves the walls of the institutional church now. So 94 cents of every dollar is absorbed internally. And then the kicker is, okay, sure, 6 cents goes over outside. Where does that 6 cents go? And that's what we follow, because people are, that's the bigger racket. There's two big rackets that we've found through the last 2.5 years. Where does that 6 cents go is one of them. Because it's really easy to say, okay, not, like the math is the math. The data is the data, right? 94 cents stays in, 6 cents leaves. That's a sad number. It should be, in my opinion, it should almost be flipped, but it is what it is. So that's the number. But then you look at where that 6 cents goes, and it's not going to where people think it's going. That's one big racket. And then the second big racket, which I'd be interested to discuss with you, is the real estate side of things.
Hmm.
Because as religious orgs, as churches go out of business here, what happens to the real estate? And the real estate was paid for by donor funds. The donors aren't getting that money back. And so
Right.
that's where, as technology and it, the internet church, so to speak, is becoming a thing, that's where it gets really interesting.
All right. Well, let's have it. If you think about the real estate of the some of the biggest churches around, and if you head over towards like some of the churches that I've seen in Europe and things like that, I mean, there's just mega money that goes into the church itself, and we've got local churches down here that have just got gold chandeliers and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
coin that goes into that. Um, but so you're saying that they're acquiring real estate, and then the business goes, the church goes away, or they, and then they
Well, so
maintain the
we're
property, or what's the go
yeah,
there?
so we'll give you an example right now. So there's a church, we're not going to name it. The show names it, but so he of course is I think he's a seventh generation pastor. So he inherited the church. He inherited about $100 million in real estate. So that real estate was donated or paid for by congregants, right? So
Hmm.
people going to the church gave their money in that plate, like you talked about, and that's how these buildings were paid for. They were utilized for good things. They held church services. They did homeless outreach. Well, his dad dies. He takes over. He realizes, hey, I want to go hang out in more popular cities in the US. I want to go to LA. I want to go to New York. I want to do this. So he needs to finance his quote unquote ministry. So he sells off a building. He said, $4 million here, $15 million here. In the last 5 years, this gentleman has sold off $63 million in real estate that was paid for by donors. So
Mm.
where does that profit off those paid off buildings goes? It goes into the bank account of the church. And who runs the bank account of the church? He does.
It does.
So he bought a $5 million home in Playa Vista in Los Angeles. His CEO bought a $5 million home in Santa Barbara or Montecito. And they're just they're living the dream. And it's like, okay, so now he's not even an in-person pastor. He's an online pastor. And so that's the biggest racket now, is
Wow.
these guys can sell off assets, bankroll it. And then what's even crazier is, because they know they're going to end up selling out of their real estate, then what's going to happen when all the money's gone? They have taken money from those sales and put it in investment accounts for future pastoral salaries. So they've
Oh,
mapped out their salaries. I don't know how many years in advance, but they have cash set aside to pay themselves for the next decade or 2 decades off of donors' money. So that's
wow.
what's crazy, is as church attendance drops, these buildings need to be sold. No one's going to them anymore. Well, where does the profit of those buildings go? Back into the bank account of the church. And who runs that church bank account? The leadership. And so you're talking about
Wow.
over $1 trillion in real estate that's probably going to move in the next 5 years.
Oh
That's
my
a
God.
like, where's that money going? Like that money could solve I would argue all almost all the global social issues if it was just utilized properly, but it's not.
Mm.
It's being used to buy homes in Los Angeles and Montecito and nice cars and getting photos with celebrities. And yeah, it's a joke.
Wow. How do you track that? Is that
Yeah.
because it's in their personal name, or is it because it's like, is it all like a company that has a division of assets, or something like that? How do you kind of like follow the money, so to
I
speak?
don't I don't do it. Luckily, there's really, really smart investigators that we
Hmm.
have on our team. But and then there's whistleblowers. We've had a lot of people come forward once they hear about the show and they're like, hey, they'll put a manila folder, boom, they'll drop us hundreds of documents. And I feel like we're kind of just becoming this like fire hydrant, so to speak, for data.
Hmm.
It's like we're I am here at this moment in my life to be a fire hose of information for the religious individuals. But what these guys do is they put everything in shell companies. So you have these investigators follow the ownership of shell companies, but every house that these guys own is in an LLC, which is owned by another LLC, which then
Yeah.
the church owns that LLC. We're exposing one nonprofit that every Christian in the world thinks they do the best work ever, and they do good work, but only about 10% of their budget goes to the actual mission. Then they have a shell company with $111 million in aircraft that no one
Ooh,
knows about. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. And it's like these, and then they, what do? They go around saying, God loves you. Jesus loves you. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And then they walk out the door and get on their private jet that no one knows they own, and they fly home. And it's the biggest racket.
Damn. So there's
Yeah.
a when you mentioned before that they sort of had this continuation of income that flows through the like a generations of pastors that go through
Mhm.
the churches, is that um like is that part of their racket, so to speak? Like they're all protecting themselves, and so do you get born into that industry, so to speak, and then you just reap the benefits of the pastors that come before you? Is that kind of how this sort of monopoly's created?
Yeah, you actually, that's a very good point. You you not only It's not only the racket, like the nepotism racket or the family dynasty racket. It reminds me of like the Bushes or the Clintons, here in the US.
Mhm.
It's But what they do is they pass down knowledge without even really, like, maybe it's conscious, maybe it's subconscious, but you learn how to play the system. You learn how to play the game. So if you're, Joel Osteen, in Texas, or
Mhm.
Ed Young Jr. in Texas, like they watch their dad do it. And then their dad dies, they grow up and they're like, what, I'm going to take this over. Or I've watched my dad and I know what he does really well, but I can spin off of him and do this. Joel Osteen, did you know who Joel Osteen is?
Yeah.
Yeah, Joel Osteen, he was in TV. He was a
Hmm.
TV producer before his dad died. And then he took over Lakewood Church. And what does Lakewood become? It's a TV production company. It produces a Christian TV show. And so they just learn from their fathers and their grandfathers. And as they pass it down, not only do they pass down knowledge, but then they pass down massive amounts of real estate. They pass down a congregation. So they
Mm.
pass down a money pool already. And then the goal is to grow it. A great example is like Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son. Like Billy Graham started Samaritan's Purse, the BGEA. Franklin took all that over, and now it generates 1.3 billion a year.
Yeah.
Billion with a B. And he took his dad's donor pool. So he took probably millions of donors from his dad's, and then he just grew the donor pool. And so
Wow.
it's family dynasties are I would argue is probably the most corrupting factor in it, because money and what's crazier is the show exposes this. It's not only pastors, it's lawyers. So
Yeah, they would
lawyers
have
are
to have a really clever team of people, like,
yeah,
yeah, organizing everything, right?
yeah. So we present a couple old school pastors from the 70s and we talk about the pastors and their lawyers, because they were
Mm.
like, you know, Bonnie and Clyde, so to speak. What's funny though is now the lawyer's son or daughter whoa, I have no idea what those balloons are over. The
What the hell was
lawyer's
that?
I don't know. The lawyer's son or daughter is now a lawyer doing the same thing with other churches.
Yeah.
So not only is the dynasty from the pastoral side, it's from the legal side because they know how to cheat the system. It's crazy.
Yeah. Wow. Does it flow deeper than just like, is it just the top, the cream of the crop getting all the spoils, so to speak, or does it flow through the system or through the ranks? Like, is everyone kind of taking their little slice of pie, or how does it work?
Well, so the little guys, I would argue, are the more well-intentioned,
Hmm.
but they play by the same rules. And that's what a lot of Christians here don't like to hear. So the same rules that apply to the Joel Osteens of the world apply to the mom and pop with 20 people sitting in their house if they file for tax exemption.
Wrong.
So it always comes down to the morality of leadership. And that's if you're a Bible believing Christian, that has failed humanity every step of the way.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
so that's what's so wild is the Christian church presents this argument that humans are flawed and we need Christ, but then the church doesn't need it itself, if that
Mm,
makes sense. Yeah, no,
yeah.
we've got this. We don't need accountability. We don't need transparency. We got this. Just you guys do. So it's a bizarre model.
Have you discovered anyone that has just used that system purely just for a lucrative benefit for a financial gain without having any intention to, do good at all? Like they've just said, hey, these guys are under a tax shelter that is a benefit to me. Let's just start a religion, or let's just start a church and kind of like formulate a company in under that structure.
Yeah, I would argue Scientology was that. L.
Mm,
Ron
okay.
Hubbard. The story goes that he had a bet that he could start a church, and so he did.
Is that right?
He was a science fiction writer. He wrote books,
All
and then one
right.
day he just decided to start a church. You know,
Yeah.
and L. Ron Hubbard actually in Scientology lost their tax exempt status. I don't remember. It was pre 2000. I'm pretty sure, but they
Hmm.
lost their tax exempt status. The IRS said, nope. You know what? You guys are nothing but a business. You need to pay tax. But then ironically, they got it back. So that's how screwed
Wow.
up it is here in the United States is it's you can do yes, there are horrible players. The Kardashians technically just started a church. And it's like, why, like, what is the reason for any of that?
Yeah.
It's the perfect cloak for money laundering, if you really think about it.
Mm.
Because there's no legal documents. You get a tax write-off, and then that money goes into an account. Like literally, if you were running a church here in the States and I was the IRS and you had enough people in your church starting to complain to us that we were like, hey, we should go look into Adrian's church, right? And we fly down and we're like, hey, Adrian, we're going to audit you. You've had multiple complaints. All you would have to say is, oh, shoot, our computer's fried.
Is that right?
And we'd say, oh, nothing we can do. And
And
we'd
end
turn
of
around and
story.
yeah, there's nothing because there's no demand to hold on to documents. There's no demand to hold on to financials. So you could just say, oh, our master computer fried. Sorry. And that's that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have any you must have a tremendous amount of pushback when you start to look under the hood of some of these churches and things like that. Is like, are you a wanted man, or is like, do you have any fear that something, may happen to you by exposing all of this?
No. Um, what's the saying? There's things far worse than death. And like people, we're so afraid of offending people today or dying young. We all want to live forever. Like the world needs more movers and shakers again. And what we're doing, we're not attacking people's faith. Like I think faith's a great thing. And it's like we're trying to almost encourage faith and we're trying to encourage community and encourage the nonprofit sector to get back to what its original mission was. And I don't think many people disagree with us. Even these big pastors. Like I think they're byproducts of the system, like I said. And like, yeah, there's gonna be people that hate on us, but it's like, and there have been already. But it's like, what are you hating on? The fact that we're just calling for accountability. Martin Luther did
Mm.
the same thing in the Reformation, and so it's like and I'm not dare putting myself at his or us at his level, but like some institutions need to be called to account, and we can encourage faith and whether you're Muslim or atheist or Christian or Buddhist or Jew, like Jewish, we don't care. Like we want to encourage that faith, but let's do it with accountability. That's
Mm.
really all we're saying. So
Yeah. Tell me about the
because
series. What about the
here's the good part. Oh, sorry, go on.
yeah. No, I agree. Look, I think if you I think it's a good point that you made to delineate between that. It's like most people in the world have good intentions. I think, there's always like a few rotten apples, and there would be a lot in that industry that would have well intentions, and there'd be a lot of people that would be below the ranks, so to speak, like that are compartmentalized and they don't really know exactly what's going on, and so their heart is in the right place. There is definitely a great message within all religions, and I think that people definitely need to get back to more of the grassroots of
Mhm.
the purpose of religion and faith and things like that. And so the business side of it seems to be it definitely mars all the good work that religion does.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I would like to know more about the series and like why you created the series. Obviously, you've got experience in filmmaking and creation and all that sort of thing, but why didn't you just go and make this um, I don't know, like a big news bulletin or something that you would expose on TV or whatever? Why go
Mhm.
down the path of creating a series or a documentary?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really good at some things and I'm horrible at most everything else.
Hmm.
And I'm just a documentary filmmaker by trade. That's what I've always made and done. Um, so the reason why it's a series is it's not, it has nothing to do with my genius or with my how I think. It has to do with I just kind of stumbled upon, stupidly stumbled into it. I always use the analogy that like I'm just stupid enough to always take the next step. So
Mhm.
I fail forward over and over again. And so it's like I'm just a bull. I've been like some of my producers were always like, dude, you're just a bull in a china shop. Like you'll just
Mhm.
go. And so I originally thought I was going to make a 2 hour documentary. The first cut about a year ago came to 4.5 hours.
Wow.
And my mentor was like, "Is it good?" And I'm like, "It's great. I wouldn't throw a second away." And he's like turned it into a series. He's like, "Tell the whole story." And so it's more like my simplicity that's gotten us here, if that makes sense. Because it wasn't until like I had my little dunce cap on of like, I'm making a 2 hour documentary. And then it wasn't until he was like, "Hey, turn it into a series," that I was able to remove those blinders, so to speak. And then what that did is it opened up the ability to go far more in depth on the investigation side and far more in depth on the history side. And so it turned into a 7 part series. Each episode's about 44 minutes. Um, and it's just, we're still throwing stuff out. Like there's so much to cover, but we just want to make an extremely potent series that gives enough information to where our audience, whether that's atheist or religious, are educated now. So they can start having educated conversations at their dinner tables about religion, about the use of money, about the use of giving to a church, about the use of giving to nonprofits, if that makes sense. Like we just want to start a conversation, a global conversation, because we know if we can start a global conversation, change will happen. And
Mhm.
so that's the mission with the series. And then we've also, along the journey, realized there's really pretty simple loopholes, or there's loopholes with pretty simple solutions. Um, it's just really hard to see the loopholes
Mhm.
because it's so, everything's so clouded and messy. And so we're developing. We partnered with a dev team, and we're developing technology solutions to stop those loopholes. And so that it's kind of a 1-2 punch. The docuseries is the educational tool. And then on top of that, we're releasing technology that churches and congregants can utilize that basically bring accountability into the system
Mm.
without it needing to be a governmental solution. Because I don't think it's, I don't think having the U.S. government shove their finger into another $1 trillion pie is the right move, so to speak.
Mm. So how does the technology work? Is it like a an accounting software, or is it
Yeah, it's part of it's AI. Part of it follows money. So you can see where money goes. And then it's kind of the perfect a development economist at the University in San Francisco. We presented it to him, and he's like, you've built the perfect trap from an economic perspective because everybody has to play the game.
mhm.
So it's a game. He's a game theorist. And he's like, the donor plays and the church plays, and then the nonprofit plays. And if one doesn't play, it everybody loses. And so it's kind of a win-win. It's kind of like the Hunger Games at the end of the day. Like everybody has to play. And so yeah, it's a fun tool, and we're going into beta next month on that, which is really cool. And
Mm.
the goal of the whole goal is it's accountability and transparency. And then the more accountable you are, the more donors you get put in front of you. And so it's basically we're basically just trying to shift um, shift resources to individuals and crews and teams that are actually doing good work and creating impact, as opposed to the ones with the sleekest marketing campaigns and
Yeah.
hottest singers, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a production. It's definitely something that I personally haven't experienced, but I've seen some of the production that goes on within some of the churches in the States, and it's like compared to what we experience over here, it's wild. It would be almost archaic in a lot of senses with most of the churches that go along around here. So it's yeah, definitely a different scene as far as my observation here from Australia. So
Yeah, we had I had angels flying over my head at one church on a zip line.
is that right?
Oh yeah, there was probably they were selling tickets to this Christmas special, and they had Santa on a sleigh, and I mean like this sleigh is probably 100 feet in the air,
Hmm.
and they have 1,200 volunteers. They were very proud to say that they had 1,200 volunteers to pull off this show, and I'm like,
Wow.
man, and you're charging people 50, excuse me, 50 to $100 a head to come watch this. This is called a
Really?
this is a production company. This isn't a church.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Jeez.
it's wild, man.
It is wild. Nathan, where can people go and find where are you up to with the series? Can we go and watch something now, or is it still ready to
No, it
be
it
released?
releases this fall.
Yep.
So either August or September. It's really contingent on the technology because we don't want the show to come out and not present the solutions at this or potential solutions at the same time. So it'll be this fall. We post a lot of stuff on our social media on Instagram and TikTok.
Hmm.
And then next month we'll be dropping the first we'll be starting to drop little scenes from the show just to get people riled up because people are gonna start seeing faces they know, and they're gonna be like, oh, so
Yeah,
you're
wow.
you're going down this rabbit hole, or they're going down this rabbit hole. So it's going to create some fireworks for sure. And the goal with the social channels is just to start the conversation.
Yeah, good. Do you think you'll go global, or you haven't thought that far ahead yet?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, the show will release globally. I produce on Amazon, and so it'll end up on Amazon. And we're gonna subtitle it and put it into as many languages as possible because
Hmm.
one thing that we've realized is this idea of the let's call it a consumerist institutional church is starting to infiltrate developing countries, which is the most sad part of it all because you have impoverished people kind of being taken advantage of by church leadership in Honduras or Brazil or Africa. And it's just, to me, that's where things go really south is you already have a standard of living below what most Americans would ever think is reasonable. And then you're putting on these huge productions. And sadly, a lot of times you have these, white American pastors flying in on their private jets, and they walk on stage and they shake some hands and touch some heads and ask for money, then bail back on their private jets. And it's just it's a to when you remove the faith element and you scrape away the pretty verbiage and you watch what they're doing, it's just a disgusting way of siphoning money
Yeah.
from people in the name of salvation.
Yeah, it's the antithesis of what they should be doing there in the first place, right? So yeah.
100%.
Nathan, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been a pleasure to hearing your story, and yeah, I'm really amazed about what you're doing. It's something that I personally haven't heard of anyone heading down this particular road in the fashion that you are heading in, which I think is great. I think there are so many good parts of religion that need to be highlighted, and parts
Mhm.
like this which also need to be highlighted, but change. And I think
Yeah.
probably the last couple of years is it's been a monumental shift. You would agree that in terms of human consciousness and evolution as to where we should be in terms of moving the needle. And I like change makers like yourself. I think it's something to be really proud of.
Oh, well, thank you. One thing I would encourage anybody listening is I feel like we're in the arena. You're in the arena. You know, like Teddy Roosevelt gave a great speech called "The Man in the Arena," and it was like everybody's flawed and failed, you know, but it's the ones that stand up and get dirty and get sweaty and get bloody that like make change. And we're gonna fail over and over again. Like the show will not be perfect, the technology will not be perfect, but to your point, like there just needs to be more people that step up and step into the arena just trying to push humanity forward, you know.
Mm.
And it's all of us pushing together that make change, and we sometimes get lost in our little realities of our days or our weeks or our even our years, but it's like cultures shift over decades and centuries, you know. And so we're just a small part of a big shift happening, and it might take 10 or 20 years to see it play out,
Mhm.
but we'll see the work we're doing better our world in, you know, in a decade or two. So I'm excited.
Yeah, amazing stuff. All right, man. Thank you so much
Awesome,
for
Adrian. Yeah,
chatting with me. Yeah, it's great to meet you. And when you're in Australia, pop by and say hello. It'd be great to meet you face to face.
yeah, most definitely, Adrian. You have a good
All right,
one.
champion. Have a good day.
Cheers.
See you, mate.